Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the webinar this evening, which, as you know, is entitled Climate Extremes on the Road to Glasgow, and I'm sure it's likely to be a very sobering experience. My name's Rosemary Lister. I'm the Professor of Climate and Environmental Law at Sydney Law School, and I'm also the co-director of our Australian Centre for Climate and Environmental Law. I should say that we're very pleased to have received 250 registrations for this evening, which just shows how much demand there is in the public and amongst colleagues to hear from our very, very distinguished panel. And before I introduce them, I would just like to give an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the tradition of custodianship and law of the country on which the University of Sydney campuses stand. We pay our respects to those who have cared and continue to care for country. And I acknowledge that I've been living and working on Darug country for the past 2 years. And I pay my respects to all elders past and present and emerging. And I always like to acknowledge as well that these lands have been the site of teaching and learning about the environment and the climate for tens of thousands of years. So our panel this evening is Professor David Karoly, and he is going to be addressing the title of Climate Change in Our Land of Extremes. Our second speaker is Professor Livelihoods, and her title is Impacts of the Changing Climate Extremes on Australia's Natural and Human Systems. And then finally, our presenter, Martijn Wilder, AM, will be addressing the title of the Global Investment Response to the Paris Agreement, Engagement Driving Rapid Change, which I'm sure will end us off on hopefully a more optimistic note. So I'm going to start off by giving you a few of my own observations. I've been following the climate change negotiations for 25 years now, and I read all of the documentation that emerges from the meetings as well as the reports that are submitted prior to the meetings by all of the UNFCCC agencies. So if we look at the stated goals of COP26, they are to secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach, to adapt, to protect communities and natural habitats, thirdly, to mobilize finance, and lastly, to work together to deliver. Now, my conclusion to date is that there has been little substantive and meaningful progress under the Paris Agreement, and the 2030 goals are not adequate. So I'm going to look first of all at mitigation, and as many of you may know, in September, the synthesis was published by the UNFCCC. And what that 2021 synthesis report does is to look at all of the nationally determined contributions that have been recorded as at the 30th of July 2021. So this includes the commitments of the EU and the United States to net zero. And what the report finds is that global greenhouse gas emissions level in 2030, taking into account the implementation of all of the latest NDCs, is expected to be 16.3% above the 2010 level. And yet, as we know, the IPCC has told us that to not overshoot the 1.5 degree temperature goal, CO2 emissions need to decline by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero by 2050. And this means that currently there is a 61.3% gap on commitments for 2030. I'm then going to have a look at climate finance, which obviously is crucial, particularly for developing countries. And in 2019, the Grantham LSE report said that with 2 degrees below and $200 billion of adaptation measures in place, the losses from climate extremes start at $400 billion by 2030. In 2019, the Green Climate Fund reported that only $10.3 billion had been pledged by developed countries, even though they agreed in 2010 to a fund of $100 billion a year. So by now there should be $1.1 trillion in that fund in terms of pledges. So in 2019, 10.3 billion. And in 2030, the latest report is only 8.3 billion. So in other words, the pledges have gone backwards. And I am aware that Biden has made pledges of $11 billion, but the GFC funding needs to be shared equally between mitigation and adaptation. Now, there is another fund, the Adaptation Fund, but it reports that as of 2020, it has received only $87.1 million into its account. With regard to the other goal for COP26, which is adaptation and resilience, every country is required to develop comprehensive national adaptation plans under the Paris Agreement, but very few have been developed to date, including in developed countries where they are urgently needed. So in 2013, the parties to the climate negotiations set up a disaster mechanism, and this is called the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. And I just want to remind you that under the Paris Agreement, there is no compensation available for damage from the effects of climate change. Now, I've been tracking the work of the international mechanism and its executive committee, which set up a 5-year plan. And to date, it has worked very hard on producing research papers. So it's produced one on non-economic loss and another really important one on climate displaced persons. And it has also disseminated a lot of information to developing countries on insurance, even though insurance is a very low penetration of insurance in developing countries. So at COP25, the parties had this to say about the international mechanism, and I'm reading directly from its report, that the executive committee needs further guidance to improve its timeliness, relevance, visibility, coherence, complementarity, comprehensiveness, responsiveness, and resourcing, and the delivery and usefulness of its products and its outputs. So I think that's the parties themselves encouraging the executive committee to do more than it has done. Now, with regard to climate displaced persons, which of course is something that we are very concerned about given the impacts of climate change, the task force on displacement, which was set up by the executive committee, produced a very lengthy report. And in 2018, at COP24, the WIM made very extensive recommendations on action that needs to be taken with regard to climate displaced persons. But I've read their report, dated the 7th to the 9th of September 2020, and unfortunately, in my evaluation, there has been very little progress or action on climate displaced persons. And just to note also that the Green Climate Fund does not separately fund climate displaced persons. This is left to national governments. So I'm moving now to the accountability mechanisms. And the first is what is known as the Enhanced Transparency Framework, whereby the Paris Agreement governance framework is all about reporting. So emissions reductions and adaptation targets need to be communicated every 5 years by all of the parties. And there are biennial transparency reports that have to be submitted by the parties by the 31st of December 2024. And this is the way in which we'll be able to see the progress that countries have made up to that date. And these reports by the countries are going to be reviewed by a technical expert review team that will evaluate progress on emissions reduction and also on adaptation. So finally, what about the compliance aspect of the Paris Agreement? Well, the Paris Agreement sets up an implementation and compliance committee. Now, this committee was only established in October last year. It's held 2 meetings, but it's really important to note that the Paris Agreement stipulates that its proceedings must be, and I quote, facilitative in nature and function in a manner that is transparent, non-adversarial, and non-punitive. So in other words, there's likely to be a great deal of negotiation between this committee and recalcitrant parties, but certainly there is no measure for punishing parties that have not complied with their commitments. So this committee has released its draft rules of procedure. These were released this year, but unfortunately in October 2020, the report of this committee was already stating that it was facing shortfalls in funding and also in its resources. So that's why it's really, really critical that when parties arrive at COP26 in Glasgow, that they take all of this seriously and they make the commitments which scientists require of them. And so it's now my pleasure to hand over to David Karoly to give us his presentation. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. And I will quickly share my screen and make sure that that is going to work okay. And if you could give me a thumbs up to make sure that everything's, lots of thumbs up. So that probably means you can hear me and the screen is showing. What I'm going to try to do is give a very brief overview of the latest update on climate change science from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was released, this 6th assessment report was released just over 2 months ago. And I've got about 20 minutes to go through the 4,000 pages of the assessment report. I probably won't be able to go through every page, and I'm only going to use figures that are publicly available. I'm also going to spend a little bit of time on covering some of the key messages from another report. But first, let me give some views from different, if you like, leaders. First of all, from the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who talked about the IPCC assessment when it came out as a code red for humanity, noting that the information in the assessment report was focused on the adverse impacts of climate change, as well as the opportunities to address emission reductions and to limit global warming. I'll talk more about that in a second. From a business perspective, Andrew Mackenzie was chief executive of BHP in 2019, and he basically said that the evidence is abundant. Global warming is indisputable, perhaps unless you're Barnaby Joyce. But look, we won't go into the politics of this. The planet will survive, and he's certainly optimistic. There's nothing that climate change can do that will destroy the solid Earth planet, but he commented as well that many species may not survive. And I know that Leslie Hughes, who's going to follow me, will be talking much more about the biodiversity and ecosystem impacts of climate change. I will also be basing my report. I was leader of the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub until the end of June this year. And we put out a synthesis report of the latest science of climate change from the National Environmental Science Programme's Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub, called Climate Change and Land of Extremes. And certainly have a look at that if you want more detail about the specific research and impacts, climate science impacts across this area. Now, what I'm going to do is shift over to focusing on a series of figures from the global perspective from the IPCC assessment. And this is figure 1 from the summary for policymakers, which basically points out the observed increase in temperatures. As long as I don't go back a slide, I hope you're still seeing this same one, shows the observed changes in temperatures of about 1.1 degrees over since the pre-industrial period, compared with the reconstructed temperatures of global mean temperature over the last 2,000 years. And what we see is that the observations of temperature change over the last 50 years and over the last 20 years are unprecedented over at least the last 2,000 years. If we look at the uncertainty estimate for these temperatures for the last 20 years, relative to the pre-industrial period, we've had global warming of more than 1 degree already. And Rosemary's already talked about the efforts to try to limit global warming under the Paris Agreement to only 1.5 degrees or below, if at all possible. The only problem is that when we look at the relative contributions of different greenhouse gases and other human-caused impacts on the temperatures, that's what's shown on this right-hand set of, if you like, bar charts. And we can see that on the left-hand side, the most important of those factors is the increase in carbon dioxide in methane since the pre-industrial period, which combined together with the role of chlorofluorocarbons and other nitrous oxide, we end up with already enough increases in greenhouse gases to contribute to 1.5 degrees of warming already. The only reason we haven't hit 1.5 degrees already is because there has been offsetting impacts associated with what are called aerosols, or small industrial pollutants and particles in the atmosphere, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, that are associated with industrial pollution from vehicle emissions and from emissions from burning fossil fuels. They reflect sunlight back out to space. They offset about 0.5 a degree of the warming already. And so that is why we haven't hit 1.5 degrees already. And unfortunately, that's the reason why we need to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because we've got enough greenhouse gases already to contribute to 1.5 degrees. What about the next graphic? Well, rather than focusing on the global average observed changes, most of the audience will be living in Australia. So let's look at what's happened in terms of global temperature change in Australia. And this is a graphic straight from the Bureau of Meteorology's high quality data set, and it shows warming of essentially half a degree in the period from 1910 to 1950, a cooling relative to the baseline. The baseline is 1960 to 1990, and a warming in the present last 10 years of about 0.9 degrees. Combine those together, you end up with a warming of 1.4 degrees. Yes, the warming in Australia is significantly greater than the global average, and that's exactly what we expect, because these temperatures are taken just over the landmass of Australia. Land warms faster than the global average. The Paris Agreement is talking about limiting global warming, the combination of land and ocean temperatures. Most people live on land. Most people are not fish and don't live in the oceans. And what that means is we expect Australian average temperatures to continue to warm significantly faster than the global average, like the global land average temperatures. That's exactly what we expect. But now, it's not just warming that's important, it's also changes in the rainfall patterns. And what we've seen in Australia is substantial changes in the rainfall patterns. These two graphics on the left-hand side is shown the cool season rainfall, which has shown significant declines in cool season rainfall for the last 20 years relative to all the other 20-year periods. And in fact, the dark red is the lowest on record rainfall throughout southwest of Western Australia and throughout much of Eastern Australia. This cool season rainfall has shown substantial declines over much of Southern Australia. If we shift now to the warm season rainfall, we actually know that warm season rainfall is much heavier in the northern part of Australia than on average associated with the wet season in the tropics. That means that we've actually seen on average an increase in rainfall in the warm season, as shown by these blue colours. And much of that increase, although it's not the highest on record, has led to an increase throughout much of Western Australia, throughout much of the tropics. And in fact, on average, rainfall has increased over the last 20 years relative to the first 20 years of this century, of the 20th century. We've actually seen an increase in Australian average rainfall. However, what's critically important is to understand that most people live in the southern and eastern part of Australia, and that's exactly where we've seen the cool season declines. And for Perth, for Melbourne, for Adelaide, and even for Sydney, there's been significant declines in this cool season rainfall. It's not just the changes in the means that are important, it's actually the changes in extremes that have the biggest impact. And these graphics show for Victoria, but it's true of much of southeastern and southwestern Australia, increases in hot extremes, substantial increases by a factor of 2 or so in the number of unusually hot days. And the hottest day in Victoria was 2009, associated with extreme bushfires and very dry conditions. This graphic does not include the 2019 temperatures, nor does this bottom one. But this one shows in the bottom here changes in the springtime number of very high fire danger. And what we've seen also is a major increase in the number of severe fire danger days in the springtime. Yes, we still get extreme bushfire days in the summer, but the biggest changes have been an increase in the frequency and intensity of bushfire weather, some very severe bushfire weather in the springtime, as well as increases in the bushfire conditions in the summer as well. One of the worst examples, in fact, the worst bushfire conditions that were experienced in the black summer of 2019 and 2020, the worst cases of fire danger is shown here, which shows the fire danger index for December of 2019 across the whole of Australia. And this dark orangey colour is now what shows the record highest fire danger in any December over the last 120 years. We can also see that this is associated, whoops, when I go to the right graphic, associated with extreme temperatures in December 2019, which set a new record high temperature for the whole of the year of 2019, and very, very dry conditions in the second half year of 2019, partly associated with natural variability, partly due to the low rainfall in the spring and winter cool season as well. So what happens now? Well, I've talked about the extreme fire danger in 2019. I've talked about the observed changes. If we want to look into the future, we could use a crystal ball, but I found they don't help me very much. The best way to try to understand what's likely to happen in terms of climate change into the future is to use complex mathematical models of the climate system run over the whole of the globe, much the same way that we use weather forecast models, but now these are predicting the weather variations and the climate variations from 1850 run right out to the present. And what we see, first of all, is if we run these climate models, not just one model, but now more than 20 different climate models from 1850 right up to the present, with no increases in greenhouse gases, we get this grey band down here. And that agrees with this blue jagged line and the blue or dark blue continuous line. That shows the decade to decade temperatures in the observation. There wasn't much warming in the first 50 years of the observations in Australian average temperature. We've extracted from the climate model simulations, run over the whole globe, just the Australian average temperatures. And now we run the climate models again, well, not just in Australia, but in the United States, in Europe and Japan and China, combine together the different simulations and look at what would have happened with the observed increases in greenhouse gases in the climate models. That's what this blue band shows for the decade to decade variations in Australian temperatures. Now there's an excellent agreement with the observations from the climate model simulations. And that means that we can only explain the observed warming if we look at including the human-caused emissions of greenhouse gases and other human impacts on the climate. I'm going to have to speed up. So look, if we want to look at what's happening in the future, we can look at the climate model projections out to 2040 or out to 2100. 2019, as I mentioned, was a record hot year in the observations. Unfortunately, it becomes a normal year in terms of the temperatures in Australia in the 2040s. And unfortunately, beyond that period, the temperatures continue to warm unless we rapidly reduce emissions. What do we have to do? Well, before I get on to what do we have to do in terms of reducing emissions, let me look at what about rainfall change in the projections. The dark black line here is the 20-year running average, the 20-year average rainfall in Victoria, and on the right-hand side for southwest of Western Australia. The blue triangle is the projection from 1995 out to 2030 of rainfall. The only problem with these climate model projections is the observations are tracking at the worst case in these climate model projections. Apologies for tracking backwards. I don't quite know why that's happening, but it is. The observed rainfall changes are tracking at the worst case of the climate model rainfall projections. It's much the same with the temperatures. We're tracking in southern Australia at the worst case of the climate model projections in the last 20 years. What about global model projections of global temperature change? Well, the Paris Agreement the Paris Agreement targets of the limit global warming well below 2 degrees. And there are only 2 emission scenarios that do that. They limit global warming with about a 50-50 chance to below 2 degrees. But that still gives a 50-50 chance of exceeding 2 degrees. That's not a confident assessment of limiting global warming. I will show in 2 slides what we need to do to achieve that. But it's important to understand that we're heading on these trajectories of growing emissions, as Rosemary talked about, and more than 3 degrees of global warming. Land average warming is going to be about 50% higher than that. And that means that Australian average warming is likely to hit 4 or 4.5 degrees. And we haven't seen on this planet, humans have not seen that level of warming in all the history of Homo sapiens on this planet. It's unprecedented. There are major impacts of those sorts of projected warmings in exactly the same way as we've seen the extremes changing in Australia. But those changes in extremes scale with the increases in global average temperatures. So if we hit 2 degrees, that's nearly double what we've seen already, and the extremes are expected to increase at double what we've seen already. Increases in hot extremes, ongoing extremes in sea level for the next several 100 years. Increases in fire weather and the fire season getting substantially longer. Increases in extreme rainfall and increases in marine heat waves, which have major impacts on marine ecosystems. I've got about 3 minutes, so I better finish up. The key points that I want to get to are what we need to do in terms of these emission reductions. We need to rapidly reduce our emissions. And these are the scenarios that I talked about already. The scenarios of emission reductions that Rosemary talked about at the beginning require net zero emissions to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees by 2050 globally, and then negative emissions. Unfortunately, we do not have the technologies to have large-scale net negative emissions. And this is not just developed countries. We need these net negative emissions across all countries, and all countries going to zero. Unfortunately, we're tracking not only growth of emissions, we still have to track down, even if we're to limit global temperatures to 3 degrees. It's important to understand that to achieve net zero emissions, that means emissions in all sectors have to fall to zero. Every ton of carbon dioxide emissions adds to global warming. And there are no easy ways to get zero emissions in industry or zero emissions in agriculture yet. So it's critically important that we need new technologies. So what are we going to do? Well, we've got one more slide that took a little while because it's quite big. I'm going to provide this as my summary slide. It was put out after the IPCC assessment. It's a comprehensive summary of where we are and what we need to look at. I'm not going to go around the clock face. I am going to share my slides, but I'm going to focus on what I believe are some of the key points that I haven't talked about already. Yes, the global COVID pandemic has led to small reductions in 2020 of greenhouse gas emissions. However, we've already seen a rapid bounce back in carbon dioxide emissions in developed countries and in many Asian countries as well. So there has not been a significant decline in emissions associated with the COVID pandemic. We know that we need much more ambitious commitments under the Paris Agreement targets if we're going to achieve limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. We need substantially increased ambition to do that. We also know that sea level rise will continue well after global warming has been stabilized. I don't have any more time. I've used up all my time. I'm going to hand back to you, Rosemary, to introduce the next speaker now, but I will be sharing my slides and the list of references with all the participants. Over to you, Rosemary.
Thank you very much, David. And just to remind everybody that this is being recorded, so we'll be sharing the recording and we'll also be sharing presenters' slides. In case you're wondering about Q&A time, we've disabled the chat function for the moment, but as soon as Martijn has finished, we'll be opening up the chat function and then we'll be taking questions until 7:30. So thanks very much, David. And I'm now going to ask Professor Leslie Hughes to present her slides.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rosemary, and good evening, everybody. And thank you to Rosemary for asking me along to speak with you today. Okay, I've been tasked with talking about the sorts of impacts that we've seen and might expect in the future of the extremes that David's just been talking about. And David, of course, has indicated that everything's going up, really, or most things are going up. We're getting more extreme bushfire seasons and longer bushfire seasons. We're having more marine heat waves, intensification of the water cycle, intensification of the severity of things like tropical cyclones, and also intensification of droughts in many parts of Australia and the world. So I'll be talking about some of the way that's been affecting 4 different sectors very briefly: our economy, our food supply, our health and security, and our biodiversity. So firstly, how about money? Climate change, of course, is not just an environmental issue. It's often talked about as an environmental issue, but it's much, much more than that. There was a recent report, in fact, just released about a week ago from Deloitte Access Economics, that updated previous estimates as to how much climate change will cost Australia in the future compared to what it costs now. They estimated that currently so-called natural disasters, and I don't think we should call them natural disasters any longer because many of them are becoming increasingly unnatural, but they're currently costing Australia on average about $38 billion a year. By 2060, Deloitte Access estimates that this cost will rise to at least $73 billion, but that's under a low emissions scenario. And as David just pointed out, we're currently tracking on a higher emissions scenario than that. So they estimated that $94 billion a year is how much climate extremes could cost us under a high emissions scenario. And that these causes from multiple sectors, from coastal inundation, bushfires, floods, cyclones, storms, all added up together. So there's no single disaster, they're all disastrous. David also mentioned the Black Summer bushfires, which of course is a misnomer because these bushfires actually started in late winter, in July in 2019, and burned right through till the middle of summer in 2020. More than 18 million hectares of Australia was burnt, which is about 3 times the size of Tasmania. And here's just some of the impacts. We lost more than 3,000 homes, 3 billion animals killed or displaced, 34 people killed directly in the fires, but another 400 estimated excess deaths occurred, mostly as a result of smoke inhalation exacerbating pre-existing conditions. More than 4,000 increased hospital admissions, and about a third of the entire population of Australia are affected by smoke in some way. These costs have now approached $100 billion, making the Black Summer bushfires the costliest climate-related disaster in our history thus far. And of course, and based on some of the things that David just said, we can't think of this as a one-off. It was unprecedented at the time. It was shocking. It should not have been surprising, but it is very likely that we could get events like that sometime in the next few decades, certainly by the end of this century. Overall, the cost of extreme weather disasters in Australia has more than doubled since the 70s. How about our food? Well, globally, global hunger has been declining over a very long period due to better supply economics, better crops and livestock breeds. But from 2014, global hunger started to rise again and has been rising ever since, with climate change and specifically increasing extreme weather events being the major cause. Here in Australia, a survey from the Australian Bureau of Statistics in 2009 surveyed 24,000 Australian agribusinesses, so agribusinesses including farm businesses. 84% of those businesses surveyed had experienced extreme events over the previous 2 years, with nearly a third of them reporting having to use their financial reserves or taking on more debt in response. Once again, climate change is an economic issue. Somebody should tell the National Party. Of course, the financial resources available, especially to smaller farmers, represent a very great constraint on their ability to adapt. A recent ABARES report estimated that there's been a 23% on average reduction in farm profits over the past 20 years compared to the previous 20, at least some of that attributed to increasing climatic extremes. We look to the future and we compare the current levels of heat stress from an agricultural perspective to heat stress under a 2.7 degree world, which is where current pledges to the Paris Climate Agreement would likely take us. You can see that in all parts of the country, heat stress is increasing. And if we look at modelled changes in crop yields to 2050 and just focus in on Australia, you can see, and it's very crude modelling, a very crude spatial scale, but we can see that most parts of Australia are modelled to have a reduction in yield. Moving on to health and our security then. The Lancet in 2009 published a landmark issue that year and nominated climate change as the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. It was a pretty big call, but I think these days most people would agree. In Australia, extreme heat and heat waves actually have killed more people than all other weather-related events combined. Looking ahead, here's just a couple of bits of modelling showing what we might expect in the future. The average days, for example, in Western Sydney, over 35 degrees could increase 5-fold by 2090, with 50-degree days in Australian capital cities being relatively common by mid-century, cities like Melbourne and Sydney. David mentioned the extreme hot weather and what happened in 2009, where the Black Saturday bushfires killed 173 people in Victoria. It was a shocking event, but in fact, the week before that, there were about double that number of people killed from heat-related causes. Heat waves are a silent killer. They don't leave the scars on the landscape left by bushfires or storms or floods, but they do kill more people. And then, of course, there's mental health. We know that hospital admissions for mental and behavioural disorders significantly increase in heat waves. And when we get droughts, that's associated with very significant increases in mental health issues, including suicides, particularly in rural Australia. But what about global security? Well, a 2019 Oxfam report estimated that climate change is displacing about 20 million people per annum. That's one person every 2 seconds, with a huge upswing in the amount of displacement just in the last few years since 2016. But our first environmental refugees in Australia are very likely to be our own citizens. So these pictures come from a couple of the islands, the inhabited islands in the Torres Strait, Saibai and Boigu Islands, which already suffer regular flooding at high tide because sea levels are increasing in the Torres Strait at around about twice the global average. This flooding is damaging infrastructure, the freshwater supply, agricultural production, leading to increased incidence of malaria. And as we go into this century, it's very likely that places like this will become so damaged and so uninhabitable that these people will have to move somewhere else. Coming back to the mental health issue, paradoxically, it's worrying about climate change that is proving to be also an increasing mental health issue. with a recent study finding that Australians are about 3 times more worried about climate change in the long term than they are about COVID in the short to medium term. A mental health crisis is upon us due to the worrying about climate change itself. And then finally, the subject closest to my heart, the impacts on biodiversity. We know that more than 90% of the excess heat in the Earth's system is being absorbed by the oceans, and this is leading to underwater heat waves. We know that warming is now detectable down to a depth of 2 kilometres, with the rate of ocean warming more than doubling since the 90s. Sea level rise is also accelerating at about 3 times the rate that it was in the 90s. And because the oceans are absorbing a significant amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, it's changing the composition of seawater and making them more acid. So our oceans are under assault from a number of different forces. As a result of those increased levels of marine heat waves, our coral reefs are bleaching. The Great Barrier Reef has had 3 major bleaching events in the last 6 years, with the loss of probably 50% of the hard corals. Mangroves have also been dying across the top end in those same underwater heatwave events. We are also seeing our kelp forest declining from a number of reasons, including the heat waves, but also the redistribution of species like this long-spined sea urchin, which eats kelp, which has now moved to Tasmania and is doing very well there, unfortunately eating the kelp that is the habitat for many other species. Due to rising sea levels, we're seeing salt water intruding into freshwater ecosystems, particularly up in the top end, the Mary River and Alligator River, with Kakadu National Park that's only 0.5 metre above sea level being at great risk. Shark Bay over in Western Australia has also suffered from these underwater sea waves. This occurred in 2011, where the largest seagrass meadow in the World Heritage Area, was decimated by increased temperatures. Moving inland, our river red gums are being affected by ongoing droughts as well as salinity. These river red gums need to be flooded every 3 years for optimum health, and that has not been happening. You'll probably remember the massive fish mortality in the Menindee Lakes in 2019 as a combination of drought, heat wave, and over-allocation of water away from the rivers. And then even eucalypts have been dying. So this aerial shot of jarrah forests, which are pretty tough species over in Western Australia, are a result, those brown patches, a result of a combination of heat and drought in the past few years. Fires have been penetrating into ecosystems where they've never been before, like Gondwanan rainforests. And these pictures are from the Tasmanian World Heritage Area in 2016, where kingbilly pines and pencil pines over 1,000 years old were killed. And then, of course, there's our wildlife. And this is how we like to see our wildlife. Unfortunately, with increasing heat extremes in particular, in some cases combined with drought, we've been seeing these sorts of impacts. Spectacled flying foxes, we lost 1/3 of the entire population of flying foxes in a single day in a heat wave in Cairns. Carnaby's cockatoos, similarly. Those possums, common ringtails, were so dehydrated and hot they came down to the beach in the Mornington Peninsula to drink seawater and died. And then, of course, this is not how we like to see our koalas. And of course, Australia, unfortunately, has the distinction of having the first mammalian extinction attributed to climate change. The brambleKey malomies up in the Torres Strait, an endangered species. Its entire habitat on that little sandy atoll was inundated by storms, and the last of the species is likely to simply have drowned. So my final 2 slides, we are in a climate emergency. It's a fact, not just a slogan. Our physical and biological world is transforming before our very eyes. And we don't have much time to turn this around. We've got a decade or less to actually move to a safer operating space for humanity and everything else living on Earth. Every fraction of a degree of warming matters, because every fraction of a degree is doing us harm. That was made very clear in the IPCC report. That means that every year that we delay matters, and every one of our choices matters. Climate change is with us because of billions and billions of bad choices, and we actually have to start making some better ones. Thank you, and I'll stop sharing my screen and pass you back to our host. Thanks, Rosemary.
Well, thank you very much, Leslie. And even though I am very familiar with everything that you've presented this evening, it is absolutely devastating. David's presentation as well as yours. And I must say that I found my own research of keeping track of what the parties are doing under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement also very disheartening. But Martijn, I'm wondering, I said that perhaps you would be able to lift our spirits by telling us about all of the investments that are happening around the world that is likely to lead to the sorts of changes that we need. And so I now invite you to give your presentation.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Rosemary. I think I'm going to sort of change tact a little bit, just talk a little bit more broadly about. I just want to cover a couple of things, and really just make some comments on leveraging off the science about a couple of things. So, firstly, where is Australia? Where's the market from an investment, a corporate, a carbon markets point of view? What we really need, and then just end with a couple of comments on Glasgow. So I think, first of all, what we're seeing in the last week in Australia is really the politics of extraction. I think the Nationals have now decided that they will end up having to get to net zero, and they will extract anything they can out of the Commonwealth to get there. And I think what's interesting about this is that we're sort of also seeing the farcical at the moment, because one of the things that Barnaby Joyce has asked for is a railroad. And for that railroad to break even requires 100 years of coal being shipped on that railroad to our trading partners, none of whom are actually interested in buying coal anymore. So we're starting to see some really, I think that in Australia, we will probably get to the federal government as it goes into Paris, committing to some form of net zero, either formally or informally. But I think one of the key things about the Australian context is that to date, we actually take a pretty poor approach to this, because we're taking a baseline year of 2005. And the 2005 base year was when we had the highest historical emissions in Australia. And in the case of New South Wales, who have delivered a very aggressive target, 50% by 2030, the fact is that with the rapid change that's already going on in the New South Wales economy, the modelling shows that we'd get to 48 to 52% in any event against that 2005 target. So I think in the Australian context, what's really going to happen is that the market and investors are really going to decide. The Business Council of Australia, under its new chair, Tim Reed, is pushing very hard towards net zero. But bearing in mind its CEO, Jennifer Westacott, until very recently, was not an advocate of net zero. And so we're seeing a lot of change in the political landscape and the business landscape at the moment. The other thing is, for anyone who watched Insiders on the weekend, the Labor Party was not really committing to anything either. It was very sort of saying we'd wait and see what the Libs would do, et cetera, et cetera. But what some people forget is the Liberals already have a emissions trading scheme in place called the Safeguard Mechanism. And all they really need to do, as per the recommendation of the Business Council, is actually increase that mechanism. And as they increase that mechanism, they'll be able to reduce emissions through an existing emissions trading scheme. So all Labor really had to say was, well, the government's got an emissions trading scheme. The Business Council has recommended to increase the targets, and therefore, we'll see how far the government goes before we make a decision. I think the other thing that in the Australian context is, in many ways, as I said before, the market is making decisions here. So in terms of, I was listening to ABC Radio this morning, and there are a number of workers in the coal jurisdictions in Queensland who are saying, they're a coal town, they rely on coal. But irrespective of what anybody does, our three biggest buyers of coal, Japan, China, and Korea, have all got aggressive net zero targets, and they're all going to phase out coal eventually, or in the case of the Chinese, if they still use coal, will use domestic coal. And so that sector will eventually just die fairly quickly. So Australia is going to go through a significant transition, both economically and politically, and it'll do so regardless of what some of the politicians do. So secondly, then that takes you to the marketplace and what's actually going on in the market. And it's particularly interesting because over the last, I'd say, over the last 12 months, there has been a rapid shift in Australia for a broad range of reasons. The first is that the task force for climate financial disclosure, the TCFD, basically require people to start to disclose the impact of climate change on their business. The financial institutions have really grabbed this, and investors have grabbed this significantly and pressured a lot of corporates to disclose what they're doing, to the extent that there is now momentum about corporates putting to their shareholders and investors plans about how they will decarbonise, and those will be increasingly scrutinised. In many of the industrials that we see, the questions that are being asked is, how do we get to net zero? And so in most cases, that comes to an analysis of, well, is there part of the business that we will shut down? Is there a part of the business that we can replace with new technology? So can we reduce emissions from technology? Can we switch to renewable energy? And that's interesting that in some jurisdictions like New Zealand or Tasmania, where it's all renewable energy, that's pretty limited. And then what is left? How do we reduce those remaining emissions? And at that point, the role of offsets and carbon markets comes in, and people are looking at that whole offset market. Now, I'm going to park that for a moment and come back to that. But the other things that are going on within the business community, within the financial community, is that people are saying, well, with this rapid transition of the economy and with these high emitting assets that really are no longer investable, there's a trend that's going on, which is that people start with, okay, well, these investments are very expensive to invest in, because if they are going to be stranded in 10 years' time, we need to get our money back. So the cost of borrowing that money and the cost of capital goes up. So that's the first part of the cycle that's happening at the moment. The second is the availability of capital. As the cost of capital goes up, the availability decreases and it becomes harder, until the point where there is absolutely no capital that's available to invest in things like coal. And we're seeing the same trends start to happen on gas. The other thing is, and David's been quite involved in this, is the concept of time and value of money. If I'm lending money to a coal plant or to a mining facility, and it's going to be tied up in litigation for the next 5 years, you're not going to get your money back. So the amount of money you have to invest into some of these new assets in order to get your money returned is such that they're no longer economically viable. And as we see new forms of energy emerge, such as renewables and hydrogen, all of these sort of high emitting greenhouse gas assets like coal, which was already pretty much on its gong, in terms of new coal and gas, are all going out of that transition. And then coming back to my other point about carbon markets, so many of the corporates and industrials do look at how do we offset emissions through investing in activities that create carbon offsets. So as many of you will know, in Australia, the federal government has a very comprehensive plan to reduce emissions. It buys offsets through the ERF. Some of those emission reductions are extremely high quality and of extremely, they go through extreme scientific rigor to create them. Others, however, are arguably not additional and have been subject to a lot of criticism. But at the end of the day, there's quite a large global split on the whole concept of carbon offsets. And in Europe, you see the European Emissions Trading Scheme carving out offsets, but European buyers are basically the largest buyers on a voluntary basis of carbon offsets in the world. So my personal view is, at the end of the day, we need to be investing in projects that reduce emissions, particularly natural and particularly nature-based solutions, so planting trees and getting those offsets, because we don't have enough time to waste, and we need to actually be investing in everything. And over time, you'll be phasing those offsets out, or you won't need them. And so the carbon markets, are a particularly interesting dynamic at the moment, because there's a lot of debate about globally through the voluntary Carbon Markets Task Force initiative, looking at how do you link these markets together. In Australia, there's been a lot of debate about how farmers can get soil carbon, whether they can trade that soil carbon overseas, what markets that can enter into, and that debate will continue. But even within Australia, the price of carbon offsets within the last 3 months has gone from really $18 up to $30 very fast. And the predictions are that Barclays put out a report a few weeks ago saying that carbon offsets would reach up to $180 within the next couple of years. Now, if we can get carbon prices to that level, the incentive to invest in forests and other projects that reduce emissions over and above chopping them down, the economics shift. And so that they are particularly important. So what do we need going forward? A lot of people talk about transition and the importance of transitioning the economy. But transition is a short-term solution to where we need to get to. We have to change the thinking of what we're talking about. And we have to go from transitioning the economy to really thinking about how do we redesign the economy. So what is the systemic change that we need with systems thinking to change the entire power system, the entire transport system, the way that we produce goods, the way that we that our supply chains work, and we need to be repositioning the economy for that. So if you simply take something like storage of energy, for example, that debate is not about just buying some batteries from Tesla. That debate is about how do we access rare earths in Australia? How do we dig them out of the ground? How do we process them here? How do we build batteries here? How do we build them so they can be used in all different forms? And then how do we recycle them at the end of their life and then put that whole life cycle together and build a manufacturing sector? So it's much more broad than just thinking slightly about short-term energy storage. It's about transformation of our economy, as we're starting to see a little bit with the hydrogen debate at the moment. The second part and the second important point about what we also need to do is the whole focus on nature. So while many people focus on the climate debate, which is absolutely fundamental, the other crisis that we face at the moment is nature and biodiversity. And that is absolutely fundamental. And without a healthy nature, we will not have a healthy planet. And adding climate change to that will basically make the planet uninhabitable. The challenge at the moment is that in the first 6 months of this year, every major investment bank on the planet wrote a report to basically say that we need to invest in nature. We need to put all this money into, talked about the Gupta review, talked about $77 trillion is required for nature, yet no one provided a solution as to where that money is coming from. So what we need to do is, the first thing is that at the moment is understand nature risk. So the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosure will be focusing very much on, if you're a business and you're operating, what is the risk that your business presents to nature, but also what is the risk to your business of not having a natural capital environment in which to operate. The second point there is, how do we value nature? And how do we value natural capital, both from a physical point of view, but also from a financial point of view? So Deloitte, for example, has tried to do some early work around valuing the Great Barrier Reef and Ningaloo, but there's a very significant global focus at the moment on how to value nature from both a physical and an economic point of view. The third thing is we then need to make sure that valuing nature, protecting nature, is something that is valued over and above the destruction of nature, whether that's preserving Indonesian rainforests over and above, planting palm oil. We need to shift that balance and do so in a number of ways. And while there's a lot of focus on changing supply chain and sustainability, we need a much more radical approach. So in the same way, for example, that many years ago, the Basel Convention was set up to require financial institutions to preserve a certain amount of capital aside so that the financial system would be stable in a crisis. We need to be seeing financial institutions and governments start to set aside large areas of nature by working with local communities to actually preserve those ecosystems that are fundamental to the planet. We also need to see other radical approaches, such as saying to people, if you would like to have a World Heritage Area like the Great Barrier Reef, you have to work out what the value of that area is and you have to fund it so that it survives, otherwise you don't get World Heritage ranking. So we need to be thinking a bit differently and a bit more radically about how we're going to fund some of the most important things to protect the planet. So this takes us then into Glasgow, which is only a few weeks away. And what do I think are the three key things there? And so I think as we go into Glasgow, what's really, really important is that the COP is successful. It's been 2 years since we've had a COP. It's been delayed. There's a lot of nervousness around how this COP will go because of COVID and everything else. But I think what a lot of people are focused on is, firstly, from a corporate perspective and investor perspective, there's a big focus on Article 6 and how does Article 6 translate into investment, into carbon, into forests, into markets, and will you be able to generate carbon offsets and trade them? And for many countries, this is actually some of the articles in Article 5 as well around forests are absolutely critical, because the view is that we have been preserving a lot of our natural capital and we deserve to be rewarded for that. So the second point, apart from Article 6 and markets, is the whole issue about financing nature-based solutions and having having a real focus on adaptation and having a real focus on nature-based solutions. And the third is about really the way that we find developed countries financing developing countries in terms of their transition, but again, with a big focus on nature. And I think what's really interesting is that there is also, what I'm seeing at the moment is I guess a challenge to what I would say is the traditional philosophical position that some countries are taking with respect to certain issues. So a good example of that is REDD+, which is basically protecting forests through reducing emissions from degradation. The view in the past has been that if you're a country that has been rapidly destroying your rainforests, if you demonstrate that you will stop that against a historical baseline, although that baseline is now moving to 2020, if you will be rewarded for stopping to chop down your forest. And the delta between the deforestation rate as it was and what you do is where you get the credit. There are a number of countries like Costa Rica, Gabon, some of the other large countries that have done, Suriname, that have over many years done a huge amount of effort to stop deforestation, maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, and are simply not rewarded for preserving those forests. In effect, under the current system, the only way for them to be rewarded would be to suddenly remove all their protection legislation and say we're going to chop it down. So there's a lot of perverse incentives built into the system. So I think there's a lot of there will be a lot of push at the COP around Article 5, Article 6, around nature, and around how do you finance that as part of the fight against climate. I think we are seeing a significant shift in that direction, which is a very positive thing. I think the combination of a recognition of everything that David and Leslie have talked about on climate and the need for further action on nature is coming together. And I think the recent the COP15 on nature and the Biodiversity Convention and a lot of the other recent developments are really important. So I think in that sense, things are moving very, very fast. I think just to end, we've seen basically in the last 4 months alone, two of the biggest investment firms in the world, BlackRock and the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund, Temasek, launch a big decarbonisation strategy. We've seen another firm in the US, General Atlantic, launch a $4 billion fund towards decarbonisation. We've seen Brookfield launch a $12 billion fund. We've seen TPG launch a $7 billion fund. So we're starting to see more and more momentum. The challenge for a lot of these investors is actually trying to find the things to invest in, because there's a huge amount of early stage venture capital in the climate space emerging at the moment with highly innovative and really interesting technologies that can be invested in. The trick is really to take that from that early stage to the next phase where you can start to pump in billions of dollars. I think hydrogen, and where you see Andrew Forrest is putting a lot of money into that area. Of course, that requires a lot of water, which is another issue, but it is about transforming the economy. So I think from where we sit, the speed in the last 6 months from an investor business point of view is remarkable. And I think, I have some optimism that things will move very fast. So that's, I think I'll end on that note.
Well, thanks very much, Martijn. And as I was hoping, you did provide some optimism, particularly around the business sector and the finance sector, as well as putting the focus on nature-based solutions. So thanks very much for that. And now we're going to move into the question and answer part, which we've got 20 minutes for Q&A. And if you would like to put your question into the chat function, all of the panelists will be able to see it, and then the panelists will just decide who is the most appropriate person to answer the question. So please go ahead and send us your questions.
Rosemary, while we're waiting, I've actually got a question for Martijn. Given the very exciting and rapid developments in the investor and business community, is it the case that governments are almost becoming redundant in terms of policy? I mean, obviously there's good policy and not so good policy, but is the business and investor community really driving the change more so than governments?
They're definitely driving it more than governments in Australia. Globally, governments have often led and pushed very hard. I think government's absolutely critical because good policy accelerates change. And so, you know, in Australia, for example, if you want to transform the energy sector, one of the key parts of that is transmission lines to get solar around the country. If the government were to de-risk those lines by simply guaranteeing them up front, they would be built a lot quicker. And one of the problems we have in Australia, for example, is the states don't talk to each other. So if you're trying to build a national electricity market and transform that market, but every state's thinking about what's best for that state, we have a real problem. And that's been one of the challenges. So in countries like Norway, where they legislate a set date for electric vehicles to take over and combustion vehicles to exit, it just simply accelerates and you get an uptake. It's a little bit like legislating for vaccine rollout, you know. If you've got the policy, it happens. And so I think policy is absolutely fundamental. It can drive change very quickly. It's just interesting that, and in some ways, one of the things that is driving us, I would argue, from a business perspective, as opposed to a government perspective in Australia, is the fact that other businesses in the world are saying, we will not invest in Australia unless you decarbonise your business. And so I think in that regard, yeah, I think policy is still really important.
Can I add something to that just a little bit? Because I think what Leslie was asking about and what you've answered, Martijn, is really about the, if you like, government policy in terms of mitigation. But there's a critically important thing, that adaptation is really a local issue for which local government and state governments are really the key players. And there needs to be important, if you like, additional effort and regulation if we're going to address the other aspect, which is managing the unavoidable impacts of climate change across all sectors. And there hasn't been much support for that so far.
Okay, thanks very much. And our first question now from the audience is nuclear the elephant in the room for baseload power generation? Which of our panelists would like to take that?
I'm going to have a quick go at this one, because there has been a fairly recent inquiry in South Australia looking at that, but Australia has been thinking about, or maybe not thinking about, nuclear power because the community does not want to support the implementation of nuclear power stations. The costs of nuclear power stations, building them, is enormous. It is significantly higher cost for supposed baseload power than renewable energy, and it would take 2 decades to actually build the power stations. They're not readily available. And you still have the waste disposal problem. The waste disposal timelines are of the order of 50,000 years to dispose of radioactive waste. It's easier to think about the shorter waste disposal timelines. It's only 10,000 years to get rid of the carbon dioxide we've got in the atmosphere through natural processes.
Thanks. And I might just add to that, to people in the audience who might want to go back and have a look at Ziggy Switkowski's report, which was commissioned by John Howard in 2006, where he recommended that 25 nuclear power stations be built in Australia, and there was a very lukewarm public response to that proposal. So the next question is, how do we stop, any chance of a carbon biodiversity market to protect Australian native forests? In other words, just to stop logging. Martijn, would you like to talk about that one?
Sure. I mean, so one of the interesting dynamics is if you took, just take as an example, state forest in Victoria. It's an uneconomic business. Largely, it's subsidised. If it had a carbon value in it, then it would be far more economic, and you could flip it into a biodiversity forest, look after it. The challenge is there's an argument around additionality on that issue, but yes, I mean the fact is that we are moving towards a lot of stopping of native forests anyway. But and what we're also seeing is some state governments looking to how they can extend their existing national parks through basically carbon and biodiversity plantings. One irony there is that if you're doing a carbon planting under the ERF, it is not very biodiverse compared to the current. To get the biggest carbon, you have less biodiversity. So the trick is to get it funded through carbon and then make it biodiverse over time. But yeah, I mean, in Queensland, for example, under the LRF, the Queensland government's LRF buys ACCUs, and then it adds to those the value of biodiversity or watershed benefits or koala habitat benefits, and adds an additional financial value to that. At the end of the day, it's either the government either pays for it or they pay the private sector to deliver it. And that's basically what's happened, but it still relies on a clear government policy to set a carbon and a biodiversity market price.
Yes, and also just to note that we've had biodiversity trading schemes in Victoria and in New South Wales for quite some time now, and there's now a very interesting literature emerging where essentially the empirical evidence is coming to light about those biodiversity markets, and there are some very serious concerns that are being asked about those.
And Rosemary, I just add, I don't actually believe in biodiversity offsets, because I think you can't destroy one piece of biodiversity and save another. What you need to be doing is basically saving biodiversity and funding the establishment of more biodiversity zones. You can't just, I don't believe you can do like for likes. I think that's part of the problem with it.
Who else would like to comment on this question of biodiversity markets? Leslie, are you?
Yeah, look, I'll say something. And I mean, obviously, I agree with everything that Martijn just said. But to come back to this question of offsets per se, I mean, a lot of the problem with biodiversity offsets as they have been used and are being used is that, firstly, planting, the best carbon bang for your buck is to plant probably a Pinus radiata forest that grows very, very fast, and then you chop it down and you grow another one. And that's not very good for Australian biodiversity. As Martijn said, a lot of restoration plantings, if they're done purely for carbon, focus on fast-growing monocultures, which are bad for biodiversity. They also have water problems. If you plant the wrong trees in the wrong place, you reduce stream flow and runoff. So, planting forests are never going to be enough to compensate and balance the carbon that's being redistributed from the Earth's crust into the atmosphere. That's a more or less a one-way flow, whereas carbon within natural systems is a loop. Trees die, they get burnt, they fall over, and then they grow up again. So that's a loop, and we can't totally compensate for a one-way flow with a loop. So we do need to be planting trees for biodiversity benefits. It will have carbon benefits, but we must not ever think and be so naive that we can just still keep burning fossil fuels and using forests to offset that one-way flow.
Great, thanks, Leslie. Well, here is the million-dollar question. How do we stop being held to ransom by a few far-right politicians on sound climate, green energy policy development and action? Well, certainly in my 25 years of following this, I've been asking that question year in and year out, as many of us have been doing. So who would like to take a shot at that?
Well, I'll have a go, And then, well, we have a very interesting federal election coming up. I think there is enormous interest now amongst groups supporting progressive independence, hoping to use the model set up by Cathy McGowan in Indi and Zali Steggall in Warringah to get what are probably pretty conservative, natural liberal voters up on climate platforms. And we're seeing at least 30 different groups in different electorates around the country, voices for or voices of. And given that the current federal government only had a one-seat majority at the last election, it won't take many of those independents getting up to hold the balance of power on climate platforms to really make a significant difference. So my short answer to how do we not be hostage to a few right-wing politicians, vote.
Okay, thanks very much, Leslie. And the next question is, to what extent is investing in nature-based products hampered by our inability to place a value on nature?
It's totally hampered by our inability to do that, because the fact is that at the moment, if I have a choice between chopping down rainforest, for which I get limited value, or I have a choice of doing a palm oil plantation, which I get a huge amount of economic value from, that generally trumps. So, you know, I remember being at an event in Indonesia, this was quite a few years ago, where the Norwegians had been talking about giving Indonesia for over the last 15 years, it's just come to an end, $1 billion towards the rainforest. The CEO of APT, an Indonesian pulp oil paper company, got up at the conference and said, we make $5 billion a quarter from chopping the forest down. What do we care about saving it? So the economics are wrong, which then comes down to the only way you can do that is through basically government policy, and really at the moment is by valuing that and putting it almost like a tax on it. So Peter's question there about whether capitalism, the economic system, it certainly is not. Capitalism is certainly not going to save us. I actually don't believe that. I think that the government policy is critical to drive change and to accelerate that change. And without that, and also to protect the economy as well. And so I think we have to start doing things like putting a real value on nature, like, you know, prohibiting certain activities. And the government's got to be very aggressive about it. We're in a climate emergency. We should basically just ban coal, end of story.
I'm just going to recommend this book by Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, and he published a book called People, Power and Profits. And he talks about progressive capitalism for an age of discontent. So I recommend that book to anybody who wants to read it. Martijn, there's another question for you here. What do you think about shared energy grids, where households can turn off their energy grids and enable their neighbours to share their energy?
Yeah, I'm very supportive of it, first of all. Secondly, I think though that there is an economic reality here, a systems reality here, which is that we have traditionally had a power system that's relied on large plants interconnected by the grid, where a certain amount of frequency in the system is required to keep it stable. We've now come in and put a huge amount of renewable energy into that grid, and it does make it quite challenging to keep that grid. As all of these different factors come in, we've had a great challenge at stabilising that sector and being able to manage it. I think people take for granted how easy that is, but it was only, you know, a year or two ago that people were actually combining wind, solar and batteries. That's very new. There's a team at ANU which are just working on now how to reverse your cars into the grid. And so a lot of the stuff that we hear about can be done actually hasn't been fully cracked yet. So I'm a huge supporter of it, but I think you need to we need to do it in a way that maintains stability. All Australians have an expectation, or just used to never having blackouts, whereas in many other countries you regularly have blackouts. So if you want to avoid that, you have to build the system in a way that that maintains stability. Now, what we're seeing, which is fantastic, is that with the advent of batteries and solar energy and distributed systems, we're able to move in that direction. And the technologies for things like like the Internet of Things and other technologies that are actually stabilizing the grid are also very important in all of this. So I think, you know, as we move forward, the technology will allow us to be more sophisticated in the way we achieve the outcomes that you've articulated.
Yes, and it seems to me as if the regulators are trying to catch up with the market, which is, of course, what very often happens. So the next question is, how can systemic change across all key sectors where systems are at risk be realistically and practically coordinated?
Well, my view is that is after the war, they coordinated major change. After World War II, we often have, I mean, Al Gore, Prince Charles and others have talked about a Marshall Plan for the planet, a Marshall Plan for nature, a Marshall Plan for climate. The fact is you need a government that is willing to engage. We have such a broken political system in this country that it just isn't happening. But really, it'd be interesting to see whether a state government could do that.
Okay, thanks, Martijn. Leslie, would you like to answer the question about your paper that you've just published?
Oh, sure. And thank you to the panel, to the audience member to highlight the paper. Yes, with some of my Wentworth Group colleagues, we've just published a paper in the Journal of Applied Ecology, which basically estimates that we could use marginal agricultural land that is not productive to regenerate a fair percentage of Australia's most needed ecosystems, and we could do that across the country for about 6% per year of the amount that the Australian government spends on defence. And if there was a half reasonable carbon price, the carbon credits would actually pay for it. So there's an article in the Conversation a couple of weeks ago, and I can send it in to Rosemary for it to be sent out. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Leslie. And then the next question is about rights to nature. Would affording rights to nature be an appropriate legal approach that could help to create long-term change to the economy? Because perhaps businesses would think differently about nature if they actually had legally protected rights. Well, Leslie, David, Martijn.
David, you were going to have a question.
Yeah,
I was going to have a crack at this, but I hate to try and provide a legal argument to when there's a very experienced lawyer on the panel as our chair. But look, you know, the comments really are that what determines legislation, what determines legal basis, is the government in power, and the government in power has to be supportive of the legislation, and the vested interests that appear to want to fund or not fund the legislative change are going to be critically important in that. It would be an interesting perspective. It might survive the establishment of legislation. It may not, and that's determined by the government, the federal government or the state governments in power at the time.
Yes, thanks for that, David. And of course, around the world, there are constitutions, legislatures, and also particularly courts that are increasingly recognizing the rights of nature. So either recognizing the rights of nature or recognizing legal personality in nature. So this is a very interesting evolving jurisprudence that's coming from a number of courts around the world. So thanks for that question. Now, we are at 7:29, and perhaps we'll just take one last question for Martijn. Is there any capacity for retail investors to take advantage of the projected growth in the price of carbon?
I think what you'll probably see is some funds that emerge with retail products that allow you to invest in the carbon markets. There's already a number of institutional type products like that. I think the other thing though is to think about, for anyone who invests in the stock market and buys shares in companies, simply understanding that those companies that are highly exposed to carbon price will actually get a significant, will suffer a significant penalty. Those who are actually moving away from that or who produce carbon offsets will actually do a lot better. So there's funds like the Melior Fund that looks at, which Tim King is running, which is basically looking at Australian ASX companies that are very, very progressive on climate. So in an indirect way, that the price of carbon will affect those companies. So, but in terms of, I'm not aware of an existing retail product in the Australian market that allows you to buy carbon offsets.
Great.
Although
Well,
it is important to note that, in fact, many of the superannuation schemes have very active, if you like, carbon schemes that are divesting out of carbon investments and funding or looking at supporting renewable energy investments and a whole range of investments in climate adaptation and climate mitigation. So you can make choices with your superannuation investments about how to do that and address climate change.
Well, thank you very much. And it really just remains for me to thank our panelists so much for agreeing to participate in this very important pre-COP webinar, and also to thank the audience for registering and for your great questions. And we look forward to being in touch with links to recordings and so on, and to continue the conversation in whichever ways that we can. So thank you very much, everybody, and keep safe. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.